Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense. You're now tuned to Future Sense on Bay FM through to 11 o'clock with Nick Jeans and my co-hosts Steve McDonald. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Nick. We're fresh back from the bush, aren't we?
We're fresh back from the bush. We're going to be talking today about the underground. The underground, there's a word. You might have noticed today, if you've read the newspapers, if you've been out in a cafe, that all the Australian papers across the board, all the Murdoch press and the previous Fairfax press, now owned by Channel 9, of course, and other press around Australia, have come underneath one banner called the Right to Know, Australia's Right to Know Coalition, and have redacted all their front pages. So you pick up the Sydney Morning Herald, for example, and most of the front page text is blacked out as a protest against the legislation that is trying to destroy press freedoms, or that's the notion. And I guess that sort of triggered in a way our theme party today, and also our experience away over the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't really trigger it because we were talking about our theme last night, but it certainly fits nicely. It's very synchronistic.
So we're going to, and for me, I mean, the word, of course, redacting the word in this way is a fascinating thing. And I think of the word spell. The word is a spell, and the words that you read in the newspapers, the words that are printed, the way that we speak, the way that we report, the way that we give some meaning to our experiences through the word is like a spell. And when you black that spell out, black that word out, you kind of change the spell. It's a bit of my take on that this morning.
I guess it becomes a dark spell when it's blacked out, doesn't it?
Precisely. Yeah. Old wizardry of some sort or other. So we're going to dip into this theme today.
We are indeed. And it's reported in, I guess it's probably been reported in every newspaper today, but I'm looking at the ABC's coverage, and isn't it wonderful that we have a government-sponsored broadcaster in this country which can rebel against government policy? I love that. I love that freedom. It's wonderful, really. We should appreciate that.
Indeed, and community broadcasters like ourselves, of course, have a certain degree of freedom, but we don't have, in a sense, or arguably the same sort of power, although there are about, I think, 4 to 5 million Australians who listen to community radio in a given week, which is a lot of people. So don't underestimate the power of this station or community radio generally.
That's right. You better play that little thing about the broadcasters not being a doctor and don't do this at home. Just to make sure.
I'll get to that when we get into more darker topics as we go forward.
That's right. And we're talking about the underground movement today, various underground movements and their role in cultural revolution. So if you've got any thoughts about the underground, maybe you belong to the underground, then text in, let us know, ask some questions.
And of course, there's many undergrounds at any one time, indeed, and we started that today. Well, not started, we actually thought about this theme last night where we were away for the weekend. We'll come back to that too, at a very interesting underground event over the weekend, which gave us a number of ideas. But we're talking today, beginning about the redacted newspapers around Australia at the moment in a revolution itself against the federal government's, coalition government's new laws that seem to be repressing the freedom of the press.
Yeah, very interesting development, and it's been triggered in part by some Australian Federal Police raids on journalists and media outlets, which came from some classified information being leaked to the media around potential war crimes committed in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there was a strong media reaction, as you can imagine, to these police raids, and it raised questions about the whole process of whistleblowers having the right to leak information and the legalities of that. And also, it's the end result of a long process, which it goes back at least to Australia signing up for the US war on terror and the various changes to law that have come out of that for our own safety, of course, as they always claim, and
or in the national interest, which is John Howard's favourite saying.
Oh yes,
national interest,
nationalism. And the thing is that these laws have been, I think you said, Nick, there's been something like 75 changes to legislation.
Since 2002, there have been 75 pieces of federal legislation intended to protect the public from national security threats, but that have found new ways from stopping the public's right to know what the federal government is doing.
That's right. And in these last days of the modern scientific industrial era, we need to remember that that particular mindset, the mindset of this fifth layer of consciousness, or the modern scientific way of being human, thinks that information is power. Yeah. And so people who are in power always want to withhold information. They always want to know more than you do. And they always want to say, no, you don't need to know that. Only I can know that. And so I often use the example of a poker game where people hold their cards secretly close to their chest. And if you know what card someone else is holding, then of course it collapses the entire game and the power structure associated with that game. You can't have a winner if everybody knows what the cards are. So any opportunity to gain power by the restriction of information is seen as an advantage. And in these days when the control of society is slowly slipping from the fingers of our governments and authorities, then they are getting desperate to hold on to that power and to gain more power by restricting information and telling us that we don't need to know things. And what a wonderful protest by the media here today, where the newspapers have blacked out their front pages. And I'll tweet a photo of that on Twitter very shortly, on the Future Sense Twitter account, so everyone could see that. And it's wonderful to see different media outlets who normally would be competing with each other, working together in what they're calling the Right to Know Coalition, of which, as I mentioned at the start of the show, that our government broadcaster, the ABC, is a member, which is so amazing and fantastic that they can get away with that kind of thing, even though the government's paying them to do it.
And even though many of us, of course, on the supposedly progressive side of politics would always damn the Murdoch press, it's the Murdoch press who are also in this. The Murdoch press has also redacted his newspapers.
Very interesting indeed, isn't it? Very interesting. Signs of change.
Signs of change.
And what have you got there? You've got a point list or something about this?
Well, there is the organisation is Australia's Right to Know. This is all the media outlets in Australia who are members of this. And there are 6 Right to Know reforms that are being sought. And these are, number 1, the right to contest any kind of search warrant on journalists or news organisations before the warrant is issued. 2, a law change to ensure public sector whistleblowers are adequately protected. 3, a new regime that limits which documents can be marked secret. 4, review of freedom of information laws. 5, that journalists be exempt from national security laws enacted over the past 7 years that currently can put them in jail for doing their job. And lastly, to reform defamation laws. Yeah, so there's strong requests, but pretty reasonable, that's for sure.
Absolutely, and it implies a misuse of the classification of restricted documents as well, because
that's right.
Again, as I've mentioned previously on the show, from my military background, I was always taught that the security classification of a document was there to predict the source of the information, not the information itself. And what we're seeing now is allegedly things being classified to protect the government from getting into trouble and losing favour.
The ABC's Managing Director David Anderson has said that Australia is at risk of becoming the world's most secretive democracy. We've seen the public's right to know slowly erode over the past 2 decades with the introduction of laws that make it more difficult for people to speak up when they see wrongdoing and for journalists to report these stories. Yeah, it's big. It's very big.
It's very big. It's very big. And, another example of this kind of behaviour is, as we mentioned on last week's show, is the offshore detention of refugees by the Australian government and the restriction of access, prohibiting the media from visiting them or covering face-to-face what's going on there.
And if you at the Byron Bay Film Festival at all, which is current at the moment, or you see a film outside of that time, there's a lovely little locally produced, or Australian produced, but it is locally produced film called Manus, which gives a completely different face to what we hear, particularly from the current government regarding refugees in our country, in Manus Island and the other localities.
Indeed. So maybe we'll take a break and we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit bit about the definition of the underground or counterculture and where those terms have come from.
Because what we're saying here, of course, is this current redaction today is in a sense it's a rebellion, and it is not an underground movement, but certainly perhaps you could argue coming from various underground countercultural movements around the world in response to various policies and directions of governments and society and culture, generally speaking. And we're seeing those influences moving through culture now in various ways.
It's definitely counterculture. It's pushback against mainstream culture for sure.
You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up. You are tuned to Future Sense here on Bay FM 99.9. It's 9:34 with Steve McDonald and myself, Nick Jeans. And we're talking a little bit, or we're leaning into the notion of counterculture, underground, and what that means. And starting with revolution, I guess. And as you can hear, we've been playing some revolutionary songs.
That's right. And I don't know about leaning into.
I think it's a phrase I borrowed from a speaker we were listening to yesterday.
I think we're swimming in it.
Yes, revolution. Music always has been revolutionary, certainly since the 60s, and arguably jazz was highly revolutionary earlier than that, among other forms of music, often associated with psychedelic substances like cannabis. Jazz was clearly associated there and demonized because of that association with particularly African-American jazz at that time.
That's right, and I think it goes back a long way. You've got the troubadour traditions,
yes.
Like the travelling teachers teaching different ways to live using music and poetry and those sorts of things.
And culture itself is an interesting word, and if you think of the roots of that, of course, culture comes from the same root as cult. And you could say, at a bit of a stretch, I think that culture is actually a cult. One's culture, to some degree, and it depends on, I guess, how much you identify with it. And that's perhaps one of the issues, is how much we identify with our culture, embed ourselves there, and don't allow ourselves to be more open to something other than that.
Yeah, I guess culture is a cult with UR.
You are a cult.
Added. So once you are added to the cult, then it becomes culture because you're part of it, right?
That's good. Yeah. Well, as we probably know, you educated people out there, culture comes from the idea of tilling soil. It comes from agriculture.
It does, yeah. It emerged from late Middle Ages English, French with Latin roots, and meaning a place tilled or tilling, and tilling, of course, being like hoeing or digging up the soil, making it ready for planting. So it implies a field, of possibility, a garden bed where something can sprout.
Yeah, and I think that's a very appropriate use of the word underground now, even though that figurative sense of cultivation through education and systematic improvement and refinement of the mind, and these kind of ideas, that not literal sense of the agriculture was not common before the 19th century. So it's fairly recent use of the idea that we grow a way of being, a value system, and so on from the ground up.
Absolutely, and in our everyday language, you can hear that connection, even though most people probably don't even realise the connection to the roots of the word culture. But people talk about grassroots movements, and sprouting of new ideas and
yes,
sort of
exactly.
Things. Very, very interesting.
Very interesting. That, really when you start thinking about that metaphor continues, and it's very big, of course, in the grassroots green movement and other movements, political movements around the world.
It is, absolutely, yeah. And it's interesting also to distinguish between counterculture and other subcultures. So you'll always get pockets of different values within society, where the dominant mainstream values are regarded as mainstream culture, and then some of the pockets of different values can be remnants of old value systems. And one example of that would be something like, for example, the mafia from Italy, which of course is spread all around the world, and it's which means, of course, family. And it's a remnant from older value systems, particularly purple and red. Purple being literally the family or the tribe,
yes,
and red being the aggressive, militaristic angle on that. Which it's a natural evolution, of course, for that purple tribalism to develop into that, and that's certainly a case with the mafia. So the mafia wouldn't be seen as a counterculture. It's not a culture that's threatening to and about to overthrow the mainstream, but it certainly is an example of a subculture.
Yeah, subculture.
Yeah. And then throughout history, there are other examples, like if we go further up the spiral of evolution to the authoritarian, the agricultural era, that was a communally oriented way of being human, and typified by structured societies and structured organisations, and there we saw the rise of like structured secret societies.
Yes,
examples, like the Freemasons, the Knights Templar, and those sorts of things, who were actually really counterculture because they were examples of emerging new values, and they were definitely trying to influence and overthrow the dominant value system at the time.
Although both of those examples, of course, come from arguably deeper roots in our prehistory, even the Masons and Knights Templar, some wisdoms that are still secret. Because perhaps they were once sacred, and that equivalence between secret and sacred still exists a lot, I think, and is dismantling to some degree. So a lot of those old secrets are coming forth into a more culturally acceptable place, arguably.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are good reasons for that. I mean, at the heart of the ancient mysteries is a very practical motivation for restricting information, in that people needed to be prepared for deeper understandings. And particularly with altered state work, if people are exposed to a radical, absolutely radical perspective, it can upset their own values anchors and leave them in a very difficult place, even to the point of sending people insane if what they're exposed to is so radically different to what they thought was real or actual. Yes. Then they just can't integrate it. So for that reason, a lot of those secret teachings were restricted to those who had been prepared and who were ready for taking the next step to a new understanding.
Do you think that's still appropriate now? I mean, it's very interesting because it's clear what you're saying is exactly right. But is that the case now, you think, because I feel like those secrets are now, they're more available due to our technology and the way that we are now on the planet, but also because perhaps we're more ready for some of those deeper, more complex secrets.
I do agree. I think you're right. And as humanity, when I say we, I mean the whole of humanity, has progressed up this spiral of evolution, we have opened our understanding, expanded our understanding, expanded our sensory awareness. And so somebody in the mainstream today would be, in terms of their values and their understanding of reality, their frameworks for understanding reality, they would have been equal to, some of the high initiates way back in history, in terms of their understanding and particularly the structure of their value systems. And so I think people are more ready now, but I also still think there is a need for structured processes of education and development and a stepped or staged approach to the revelation, the revealing of deep truths.
Interesting. And of course, social change is often seen as incremental, or just sort of, predictably moves along at a certain linear pace. But it's not really the case, because once in a while outbursts of resistance break open a world of possibility, I'm quoting here, creating unforeseen opportunities for transformation, including, indeed, according to a leading theorist of disruptive power, Francis Fox Piven, the great moments of equalising reform in, for example, American political history, securing labour rights, expanding the vote, or creating social safety nets, have been directly related to surges of widespread defiance. And unlike elected officials who preoccupy themselves with policies considered practical and attainable within the political climate of the moment, social movements change the political weather.
Yeah, that's true, and this is how change happens. It's not a linear thing. The human consciousness and society, everything that comes out of human consciousness really is essentially a complex adaptive system, and complex adaptive systems don't change in a linear fashion. They fluctuate wildly. They go through periods of stability, and then when life conditions change and they need to adapt, then that adaptive process involves fluctuations. Yeah. And if you were talking about like a scientific or mathematical graph, fluctuations both up and down or towards both poles. And that's what we're seeing in society at the moment. And of course, we're going through change, not just at a societal level, but at a planetary level. And so we're seeing the same kind of dynamic in our climate as well, where we're getting peaks of hot, peaks of cold, and people are guessing, at the linear trajectory of that, but not in a very educated way, in my opinion.
You're tuned to Future Sense. It's 9:43 here. We'll take a break. We're going to be talking a bit more about some of the local experiences we've had recently with some of the underground too, which is rather important. And
that's like this is a revolutionary edition of Future Sense.
It is indeed.
You're resonating right now on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans.
We are talking about counterculture, about revolution, about the underground through history, and in relationship to the evolution of our psychological development, our new value systems that are emerging, or how value systems emerge on the planet, and how these countercultures factor into that to some degree.
And we're, of course, right in the middle of another renaissance right
Indeed.
now. And this is the way that values change when we go through paradigm shifts, is you get these little bubbles of different thinking that crop up as essentially subcultures, countercultures in particular, because they're opposing the dominant culture, and they represent something new, a new way, which has emerged out of the growing complexity of a society. And looking back in history, if we look back to the previous major paradigm shift that humanity went through, which was from the agricultural era into the scientific industrial era, there were little waves of Renaissance happening way back. You know, I'm looking back to some of the Renaissance of the 12th century, which was an earlier one, not the European Renaissance, but an earlier one, and then on the web reading about that, it's mentioning even earlier waves going back into the 700s and the 800s in France, waves of new thinking that represented very, very early stage scientific industrial thinking, new perspectives that were particularly individually oriented rather than communally oriented, and breaking out of the rigid and very conformist structures of the agricultural authoritarian era. So right back as early as the 700s, maybe even earlier, there were little waves coming through where little crops of new culture were sort of growing up and then also subsiding because they didn't have the momentum or the popularity to really sustain themselves. But each time, I'm sure they made some impact, some small impact on dominant society before they faded away again. And then, of course, there were other incidents or other occasions mentioned in the 800s, the 900s, and then we have this Renaissance of the 12th century, which was at the time of the High Middle Ages, which was including your social, political, and economic transformations, and intellectual revitalization, and strong philosophical and scientific roots. And this is at a time when we were pushing back against the conformity and the deference to higher authority. Which was really about an empowerment of the individual, and allowing people to believe that they could discover the truth themselves. They didn't have to rely on whoever the authority was, be it earthly authority or heavenly authority, to lay down the rules.
Well, of course, a lot of the, as you're saying, a lot of the teachings of the time came from the great religions, and but those texts at that time were basically only available to a very, very small elite number of people who could read them, who had access to that information. So the rest of it was kind of secondhand. This is the truth. You follow this, and that's what you're going to get. And so
that's
forth.
right, and it's the truth because he or she said so. Right?
Well, usually he said.
But this is not to forget that agricultural era was communal. Therefore somewhat feminine,
somewhat more matriarchal in places,
flavoured and themed era. So we shouldn't lose track of the fact that there were queens, ruling countries, queendoms, I guess you would call it at the time. And then pushing forward in history, we had things like the Protestant Reformation of the Catholic Church, which was a little rebellion against the authoritarianism of the Catholic Church by Martin Luther in Germany. And one of his big things was translating the Bible, the Christian Bible, from Latin into German, so it could be more available to the general public, and they could actually understand what the priests were saying in these religious
and start to broaden the mind and start to contest that very stuff. Therefore,
that's right. Yeah. So it was a process of empowering the individual to understand and to make decisions for themselves. And then we progressed further, and these are all waves of emerging scientific industrial thinking and values that were appearing throughout history. And the waves were getting they were getting bigger and stronger and washing further up the beach of change as the tide was coming in.
Did you just make that up?
No,
fantastic.
I said it before. As the tide was coming in on the scientific industrial era, and Romanticism was an artistic, literary, musical and intellectual movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century and sort of peaked between 1800 and 1850. It was characterized by its emphasis on emotion and individualism, as well as glorification of all the past and nature, preferring the medieval rather than the classical. and it was partly a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. So this is very interesting because it's this regressive value search, as we know, is a characteristic of any paradigm shift, and there are echoes of this romanticism in the current shift beyond the scientific industrial into the humanistic and network-centric relativistic era that's emerging right now. And we've seen the same themes, which are, you know, a flashback to the past, seeing the past as being better and desirable, and even something that we should go back to rather than what's emerging. And even as the new revolution happens, you know, as these new countercultures grow up, there's pushback against them as well. And in this romantic era, there was a pushback against the emerging industrial revolution, and you know, we're seeing pushback now by elements of the mainstream, of course, against the emerging culture that's coming through right now.
Well, Victor Hugo, the French poet and novelist and dramatist of that very time, of the Romantic movement, was famously said this: "An idea before its time must wait, for no one is crazy enough to grasp it at the moment that it's occurring, and an idea whose time has passed must hope for a future in which it will be needed again. But an idea whose time has come is a force. It changes the world. It alters reality. It's unstoppable." And I think that very notion at that time probably was something that hadn't really been declared before, and became a statement of I guess of hope that you could actually shift and change things. I think that expansion of the human capacity to think that way in a movement is interesting at that time.
It is very interesting too, and that, you know, the earlier Renaissance, particularly in the 12th century, part of that was the invention of the printing press, where all of a sudden we had another way of communicating apart from word of mouth. So that in itself was a radical shift, and that gave power to and enabled, you know, the change that was to come. Then the European Renaissance, which most people would be aware of, then rolled out between the 14th and 17th centuries, and this was an emergence of the scientific way of viewing the world, and of course there was big pushback from authorities against that, and some people arrested and burnt and poisoned, etc., for speaking things that weren't according to the higher authorities' list of what to say and what to believe.
Sounds a bit familiar today with the redacted press in response to the suppression of our current masters.
That's right. Yeah. They say, what do they say? History doesn't repeat, but it sure does echo.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you know, through the Renaissance, that led us into the scientific and industrial revolutions, which were really major waves of the emerging scientific industrial paradigm, which was strong enough and structured enough to actually allow its emergence as the dominant mindset globally.
Yeah. And should we take a break?
Yeah, I think that's a good foundation. We'll come back and talk next specifically about the current paradigm shift and the role of underground movements and counterculture there.
You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.